We can organize it. Before you can. We already. Now you got there's this volunteering and now last
you to take your seats and come in and fill from the front. Gosh, it's so lovely to see everybody. It feels like a bit of a family wedding, to be honest. There are people in this room that I haven't seen since. This is the Regional Studies Association's second face-to-face event since COVID. So we met in September in Leipzig for our central and that was another event. COVID, we've been busy. So we've run over 180 online webinars. Over 7,500 people have participated in our online activities. I cannot tell you what a relief it is, though, to be back in a room with real people. And I encourage you to make the most of the opportunity. Try and speak to somebody that you don't know. Let's all get that networking going again, because that's actually what a learned society is about. It's about growing communities, and it would be really wonderful. I'd like to congratulate you on actually making it here. Our country is a little bit broken at the moment. Some of you might have noticed that. So the strike was not there. Then the dates were changed, and there was a strike. And then the strike was off, and then the rail company said they could adjust that quickly. So effectively, the strike was off the on. And we've had about 10 million emails from people saying, I'm coming, I'm not coming. I am coming, but by a different route. I don't know if I'm coming. So thank you. Thank you for bearing with us as we've tried to navigate this. It's really great to see you. It's a great programme. Any problems, speak to the staff team who are on the registration desk. And without any more ado, I'm going to hand over to Marcin Dabrowski, who's going to lead us off in our first session of the conference. Marcin, the floor is yours. Thank you. Great, thanks. Any problems, speak to the staff.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to chair this first opening session of the conference. And this session will discuss sustainability transition in education for different regions. And we will have three speakers with us today. We will begin with Lars Student from Western Norway University of Applied Sciences. Then we will follow up with Evelyn Leuven from Wageningen University for Netherlands regions. And finally, we will close with the presentation from Joanna Williams. We will begin from Bartlett at the UCL. And myself, I'm based at the Delft University of Technology, and we will urbanism. So the session will be kept interactive, and we will try to engage you in a traditional way, but also using Mentimeter. Myself, so we'll be using this device throughout the session to ask some questions, for some reactions. So perhaps either you could use your mobile phones to just go to menti.com traditional way, code. We'll show it again later as well, or just scan the QR code. So we'll be using this device just like I'm being photographed. So yes, that's what we'll be doing then, asking questions in that way. So again, without further ado, I think I'll hand over to Lars just for his presentation. So Lars, please, the floor is yours. Just like I'm being photographed. So yes, that's what we'll be doing then. That way. So again, without further ado,
all right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks a lot for organizing this. It's really lovely to be able to meet in a physical setting. So I won't have much time. I'll use the next 10, 12 minutes to reflect a bit on work I've been doing at the intersection of research, policy and practice in the field of urban and sustainability transition in the past 10, 12 years. So first of all, at the Lund University at Circle, where we engage a lot with Renova, the Swedish innovation agency, and doing analysis and evaluations of work on innovation policy programs around societal driven innovation, transformative innovation policy, their terms of missions. Then I've spent a few years in Australia at the University of Melbourne as the City of Melbourne Chair of Resilient Cities, which is a partnership with the local council of Melbourne, and also involved in collaboration with the 100 Resilient Cities Network, which is a lot about doing embedded sort of action research around themes of resilience, innovation, transformation, and urban setting. They'd also detoured there on a regional setting, helping to develop a sustainable smart specialization strategy for the Gippsland region in regional Victoria. Just found out that this sort of pilot, we'll talk a lot about pilots in a bit, has now become mainstreamed and has become sort of the mainstream approach for regional development in regional and rural Victoria. And last but not least, my newly adopted home region of Western Norway, which is the heartland of the Norwegian oil and gas industry, but which is at the same time a region which has set itself very high ambitions in terms of climate emissions reduction, and is looking actively for pathways to diversify its sort of oil and gas specialization into low carbon, zero carbon future. So I should probably acknowledge that my engagement with sustainability transition is very much sort of informed by reading and interacting a lot with the so-called sustainability transitions community, which emerged in the year 2000 as sort of the subfield of innovation studies with a sort of a crossover to science technology studies, as the figure shows, and which really sort of engaged with the question about how do these sort of major shifts in social technical systems come about and could lead to more sustainable patterns of consumption and production. A term that was often used was there as system innovation. And that sort of system innovation is typically a very multifaceted process of industrial change, industrial restructuring, but also change in terms of technology, of course, in terms of culture, norms, values, many of you probably know some of the sort of legacy, the intellectual legacy that came out of transition research, which originated in the Netherlands, parts of it in Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Scandinavia, UK to some extent. But key concepts are, for example, the multi-level perspective on social technical transitions pioneered by people like Van Veelt, Johan Scott, and again, work on technological innovation systems, which really focused on the early stages of innovation system build-up and what are some of the key processes at play in sort of the emergence of green technologies, green industries. But this body of literature is also very much engaged with sort of governance questions and action research and develop notions like transition management and strategic issue management. I'll come back to that in a bit. Shame on them. A lot of their initial sort of theorizing was totally aspatial. And if sort of some sort of space was considered, there was often sort of a degree of methodological nationalism. So sort of implicitly just sort of saying, we're going to look at the transition in the Netherlands. As again, this picture shows. But things have evolved in the past 10 years, and the subnational scale has become increasingly prominent in transition research. The picture here on the left shows, sorry, it's probably completely unreadable, but trust me on it. It shows how the sort of theoretical foundations in transition research have started to diversify and become more heterogeneous. Whereas sort of initial work very much built on level perspective, niches, regimes, technological innovation systems, but over the decades it has really become much more diverse. And geography, urban studies, regional studies have become really one of the cornerstones in transition research. and also recent scope research that we did for an editorial for a special issue in the Cambridge Journal of Regions Economy and Society, showed that there's a real sort of increased attention for the regional level in the energy transition research. Okay, so I would like to really focus now on, there's been a lot of contextualizing of concepts coming out of our transition studies, a lot of studies looking at the impact and outcomes of transitions on regions and cities. But I would like to ask the question really, sort of how can cities and regions be agents of change for transition? So we're going again back to that governance and policy question. And I'd like to invite you to share your thoughts in the Mentimeter poll on sort of what are, in your view, we're really experts in the room, I guess, what are, in your view, sort of the key policy concepts that cities and regions deploy, enact to govern sustainability transitions? Think of smart specialization, which is increasingly turning to sustainability, the mission approach to innovation policy, but also the yes, like cities, I'm going to talk about smart cities and so on. And hopefully we can discuss a little bit more at the end. Because I think it will be an interesting question whether we see still a sort of a prevalent diversity of policy approaches to govern transitions, or whether we are seeing some convergence, some sort of dominant designs emerging around policy approaches and processes like isomorphism. I think I already see that a lot of people are focusing on living labs. That's a nice cue. To the next slide. Because I would like to really focus on and elaborate more on this sort of focus on living labs, tactical urbanism, experimentation in governance and policy around sustainability transition. And again, coming a lot from the transition field, I should really acknowledge that the multi-level perspective really has a legacy in informing that focus on experimentation, on living labs, on test sites, on piloting and demonstrating sort of innovations to achieve transformative change. Because that's sort of where the model, the NLP model, sort of puts the agency. It's really at the level of socio-technical niches. And that's in a sense a very sort of sympathetic and potentially hopeful sort of message, because it would imply that sort of small actions, small initiatives have the potential to leverage large-scale transformative change at a system level. Though it needs to sort of, it's in an interplay, of course, then with the inertia, the path dependency around the regime level of innovation. So the framework, I'll criticize it in a bit, but I want to also really sort of give it credit for qualifying our understanding of the role of innovation in sustainability transition beyond sort of the technical fits, perhaps, but more sort of emphasizing the political nature of innovation processes, issues of contestation, pushback that are really at play when we're talking about innovation and sustainability transitions. And in a sense, has been sort of also paving the way for the increased focus within our community on the dark side of innovation. However, I do think that there's also a fair share of policy mobility that has happened as a result of sort of the emphasis on niche level experimentation that is coming out of the Dutch School of Transition Research. And sort of the prescription coming out of transition management, strategic niche management, as sort of a governance technique, is that you need to sort of experiment with socio-technical innovations around, say, shared mobility, around new types of currency, around community renewable energy initiatives, and that is partly about sort of developing innovation, but a lot also about testing and legitimizing and institutionalizing innovation. And it does that in a very sort of deliberative, participatory way, with sort of a view to include all relevant stakeholders, and with an emphasis then on processes of social and technical learning. And we've been sort of following the sort of how this sort of transition management approach to transition government has traveled. And partly it sort of made its way to Sweden, and in sort of, especially in sort of the implementation around how do we get to mission-oriented innovation policy, the sort of focus on transition management has been quite strong. And even it got the Prime Minister of Sweden involved at that time in a sort of a backcasting workshop to deliberate about transition pathways and how to implement missions in the Swedish economy. So typically a lot of workshopping, a lot of sort of stakeholder consultation, but then sort of translated also in a sort of material sense in, say, street level living labs, technical urbanism, but, and that's sort of the critical question, with the view that that sort of street level innovation is supposed to scale up to societal transformation. And I think the sort of million-dollar question is, will it really do that? So I'm a bit critical of sort of the managerial sort of connotations in this approach, and as a regional scholar, of course, ask the question: is this a one-size-fits-all? Because it seems that lots of governments in cities and regions really are jumping on the bandwagon, but it seems that actually the translation of these techniques needs pretty hard and difficult sort of institutional and political conditions on the ground. And I'll try to elaborate a little bit on that. So rather than sort of seeing it as a technique, I would like to sort of take a more broader framing around experimentation as really capacious innovation processes, and emphasizing the learning that happens in innovation, but really in the context of sustainability transitions under deep uncertainty. So I really acknowledging that a lot of sustainability challenges relate to big problems without a clear problem framing, with a lot of sort of new problems arising as we sort of implement solutions to address sustainability challenges. So that sort of broadening out then means that we are considering a broader suite of actors, innovation agents beyond firms. Of course, firms are included, but there's an increased emphasis also on social movements, public sector as sort of active innovation agents, other forms of innovation, social innovation, grassroots innovation, frugal innovation. We really see sort of a plethora of new forms of innovation emerging under the header of transition and experimentation. But importantly, also new rationales for innovation beyond sort of competitiveness, competitive advantage, economic growth, but rationales related to sustainable development goals, even though we're not really clear yet what the development models are that would inform those rationales. And finally, of course, we need to rethink the ways that innovation is supported when taking this more broader perspective on innovation. So still the default is a lot about doing sort of innovation labs, living labs, public policy labs, very sort of micro level. And in a sense, it's an invitation also to look a little bit more closely at the innovation projects that are being funded through innovation policy at a meso or a macro level. But that focus on labs and experimentation has also been criticized for a sense of solutionism and a sort of imperative that all these sort of experiments, test beds, sort of need to scale up. And people have been calling out for the politics of that scaling. The recent paper by Footnow. Also, Mariana Mazzucato, in her work on missions, has emphasized the importance of bottom-up experimentation to effectuate missions. But she's not very explicit. She's rather silent about what she actually means with experimentation. So there's sort of an interesting sort of focus on directionality in innovation through the lens of sustainability transitions, but it's unclear yet how that plays out against principles of subsidiarity. And so the multi-level governance space of missions is largely untouched yet, despite missions having become such an important policy concept in this European research and innovation policy. And the thing I wanted to sort of bring to the table here is this sort of focus on experimentation really about testing innovation and technology, despite often sort of the way it's portrayed in living labs and so on? Or is it really about sort of testing new orders, new social orders? And it's much more about sort of the institutional, the organizational, the cultural change that these experiments are sort of probing and testing. So less of a focus on sort of fit and conform experimentation, but more on, as Plenary call it, stretch and transform. It is more about the changes in the selection environment around innovation, rather than making innovations fit to an existing selection environment. So to wrap up and to conclude, for as a sort of a transition scholar, it's very interesting and encouraging to see that there's a greater emphasis on directionality in innovation policy through notions like missions, transitions, transformation. But I fear that there is also a risk that these become quite sloganistic, creating kind of ceremonial policy responses. All smart specializations are now going to sort of address the SDGs. So I think in order to do this in a more sort of effective way, we need to better understand the meta-governance of such policy experimentalism, and pay not just attention to the actual sort of sites of experimentation as is currently done, but really sort of more the meta orchestration of such experimentation. Who sort of organizes it, who makes sure that these experiments actually communicate with each other, learn from each other. There's a lot of emphasis there on using really the notion of diagnostic monitoring, not just doing summative monitoring and evaluation of innovation projects, but really also formative. But then the question is, if you do formative monitoring and evaluation, you do a lot of work on sort of idiosyncrasies of experiments and how they travel in a sort of interregional context. The neglected issue of learning from failure. A lot of innovation, a lot of experiments go wrong, and there's a lot that can learn from it, but it's often sort of rushed under the table. And finally, then sort of an emphasis really on what's the institutional work and the capacity that can be played in order to engage with this sort of turn to quality experimentalism or government experimentation. So some sort of hopefully provocative questions to wrap up with. We're of course at the same time in an age of climate emergency, a biodiversity crisis. I mean, there is a real sort of storm of crisis happening, and so the IPCC sort of mentions all the time that we're not achieving our emission reductions. So experimentation is a very sort of light brush, low cost potentially, and ephemeral sort of policy approach. And the question is there still time for experimentation? And I guess what we need to ask ourselves much harder is, so what happens after we finish experimenting? What do we do with all these living labs, these sort of technical organism initiatives? How do they actually sort of make an institutional impact? Thank you.
We have time for one quick question from the audience before we go on this, or then we'll come back and open the floor later. So would you have a question to us at this stage?
Thank you.
We have time for one quick question from the audience, or then we'll come back.
I think there is time for experimentation, but it's a necessary but sufficient approach, but not sufficient approach. And I'm a bit worried that it has become a bit of a silver bullet, and that it sort of also is used for ceremonial, symbolic purposes. Because it is, as I said, so it can be relatively low cost. It's inclusive. It makes people, stakeholders feel engaged and committed. But the question is, what is really the effectiveness of these sort of labs, experiments, test beds? So unless we ask that second question, so what do we actually do with that sort of explosion of experimentation? Then I don't think there is time for experimentation. The question is, what is really the effectiveness of these sort of labs?
Thank you very much.
So unless we ask that second question, what do we actually do with that sort of explosion of experimentation? Then I don't think there is time for
Well, let me just take over while they're talking. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Eveline van Leeuwen. I'm professor of urban economics at the Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And I'm also the scientific director of the AMS Institute. It's an Institute for Advanced Metropolitan Solutions. And it's a collaboration between Wageningen University, TU Delft, MIT, and the city of Amsterdam. And actually, it's a very nice example of some things that also Lars talked about today about having living labs, making sure that you have impact with living labs inside the city, and you can learn from it both from language and from society. And I really like the last question you asked there. Do we have time for experimentation? Because I think, and I want to repeat, the urgency is enormous. And the world is literally on fire in many places. We have droughts, we have flooding. And if we want to manage that to stay below the 1.5 global warming, we only have 12 years left and we need to be carbon neutral. And so we not emit any carbon anymore. That doesn't even allow companies, for example, to grow in this community. And so there's a great urgency. I also think the good news is that we realize this urgency that there are a lot of regional differences, and that we increasingly acknowledge that the different challenges that different regions face, and also the potential difference in solutions. And so I would say that actually it's quite a heavy responsibility from us, regional and spatial scientists, on helping, let's say, the world to understand how space matters and how different people in different regions have different challenges and different solutions. And I think beyond regions, cities are seen as epicenters of impact. Of course, there's a lot of consumption taking place in cities, a lot of waste taking place in cities. But we also have to realize it's because there are a lot of people in cities, and if these people would be spread out of, let's say, the rest of the country, the situation, the environmental impact worse in our economic development part of the world. There's a lot of, and so next to that, there are also great innovation, but we have a lot of different ideas and different backgrounds, but also a portfolio of activities, which, for example, in the context of circular economy, it's very useful not only to find solutions, but also to experiment in its close vicinity and in spatial, close and nearby planets. And of course, cities are places clustering with people. And by that, cities are also very important for transitions, not only for the solutions, but also for experimenting and to start to experiment. The question, of course, is how. Unfortunately, I'm not going to answer that here, but I just wanted to put some seeds in your mind in how to think about this kind of transformations. Because I think a lot of people would argue it's the economy that's too bad, and the economy is the solution. If we would have more innovation, a clever economy, then we can solve it. We've always done. Actually, I think that the economy, because the other side, people also have a lot of criticism about our current economic system. And I think that our economic system is one of the pink elephants in the room. It's not something that we like to talk about, or it's a very sensitive topic. So here I also would like for the mental leader to ask your opinion about our current economic system. But I think that our economic system is one of the pink elephants. So here the first question is, to what extent do you think, and just be very black and white, and you can say perhaps, but do you think it's our current economic system that caused the climate situation and the challenges we face now? And I see some people saying no, and actually I would love to ask why yes and why no, but there's no time for that, perhaps in the discussion or perhaps later. Some people are not sure. Overall, the answer is yes. Challenges.
36.
So the second one, why yes, why no, is how do you believe the current economic system can solve climate sustainability and challenges we face today? How is your, let's say, your trust in the current economic system? So the second one is some say yes, some say perhaps, but it depends. Challenges. How is your, let's say, trust in the current economic system? No. Yes. Perhaps, but depends. then I think the next question. And so then, what do you think? So some say the economic system, the current economic system can still help, others say no. And so if we think about sustainability transformations, for you, what is the order that we should focus on? Is it the economic system to change it? And so then, is it the environmental system to better understand the environment origin? Is it the social system? And so if we think about sustainability transformation, for you, what is the order that we should focus on? The economic system? Is it the environmental system to better understand the environment origin? Is it the social system? So it's the economic system. Here, unfortunately, I don't know if you answer the current economic system or a better economic system. That might be for later. Social system. Then I want to go to the final question, most people filled in, because then I want to know your background. And if everything works, then we'll find, I don't know, a relationship between backgrounds and answers. That don't work. Okay. Okay, so that was, unfortunately, that's possible with Mentimeter to have a kind of cross type of answers, but it didn't work here. Perhaps I can look at that later and see the relationship. So that would actually be my main point. Yeah. So to what extent are there also here different opinions or images of the future, if you like, between geographers, between economists, between planners? And anyway, it's nice to see them and sort of the different disciplines here, which I think is really important. So to what extent are there also here different opinions or images of the future, if you like? Because I think there are different opinions about the economy, and also there are different answers. And so far, when we talk about the sustainability discussion, we talked about people, planet, profit. So they're all important. And I know at that time that was already a big step. And I think also we know in reality it's this, and when we make plans, when we think about the future, it's the economy. And then of course, oh yeah, we also have to take care of the environment and look at the subject. Actually, if we think about it, and we talk about sustainability, how come if the economic system becomes equally important as the whole social system and the whole environmental system? I think I think it's a kind of wrong way of looking at reality. And actually, I think it should be like this. We should look at society and social implications. People, because we are an environment, and we are part of the environment. We should need an economy that's facilitating sustainability. It's not fighting sustainability, but it's facilitating sustainability in an environmental and social way. How? I think that's really an important question that we have to think about together. And because also, and I think it's also in line with Lars said, we have this kind of, if you want, reunification of certain thoughts, also of the economy. Let's take the circular economy. I think it's very good that we increasingly look at circular economy. There's some sessions here at the conference as well, very important. But we also have to realize that it's not only the circular economy. The circular economy thinks about basically we have our production and consumption, and as long as we do it, we don't have any waste, we don't lose anything, we keep it, we close the loops, then it's sustainable, or at least then it's circular. But realize that actually for a lot of people, there's not so much sustainability involved. I'm not saying for everyone, but if we talk also to funders, for example, in circular economy, it's just, can we have new innovations, clever innovations to produce the same way we do, and then be circular and in a way that we can maintain what we usually know. And we also know from a lot of literature, of course, we've become much more efficient. We produce much more efficient, but we also consume more. And at the end, the net effect is that we consume more and also it's higher. And so we should really also in this circular economy thinking, take on board sustainability. That's the end goal, and also circular economy is not a goal in itself. And actually, the circular economy is not possible to have a circular society. And because also we here as people are more than consumers, we are citizens. The economy and the whole system needs to become circular in order to have a circular society. So all actors need to be on board. And it's not only about producing in a circular way, but for example, also sharing much more, doing more things together, and repairing and so on, which is all part of a circular society. not necessarily of a circular economy. And so that also the transition to circularity requires a profound social transformation. So I like that Lars spoke about the social technical transformation, and the next step is also the social ecological transformation. And so quickly, what do we need? First of all, I think it also has to do with this economic rethinking economics, but also rethinking our economic system. And so we need a new joint goal variable, and that's not easy, but I think we need to go beyond GDP. That's something that we know. But what is it to go beyond GDP? That's not an easy thing, but it's a thing we need also to work on. And so what is it that really matters? How can we measure it? Because we need to evaluate, we need to see how if things are going actually in the right way, in a multidimensional way. How does it differ between cities and regions? And so, for example, at the AMS Institute, the City of Amsterdam asked herself that question. And what is it that really matters? And with the City of Amsterdam, we're working on an ideals monitor. What are the ideals in the city? How can we measure it? Taking on board, they do a lot with the donut economic thinking, for example, the sustainable development goals. Can we bring it together, have a kind of ideals of the city and being able to measure it and to see progress if what we are doing with the investments actually contribute to a better place to live. Secondly, we need more insights into the system that also relates to circular economy. And we need to better know what's been produced, what's the impact both on the social and environmental terms to much better understand how our consumption here impacts people, ecosystems elsewhere, and also in the future. An example for a city in the Netherlands, we looked at the food system. What are the Almere people consuming? We used input-output tables, interregional ones. We used environmentally extended input-output tables, and we could see that in this little town, 200,000 people in the Netherlands, based on their consumption of certain fruits and sodas, there was a big impact on water use in Africa. And think of this Almere, it's reclaimed from the sea, a lot of water issues. Because of their food consumption, there are issues with water in Africa. And if we know that kind of things, we understand the system, it's also easier to have that is not an improved or small wins in our sustainability transformation. If we know that system, not only, but I think it's important to have better insights into the system. That is also very helpful and important for redistribution of cost and benefits, because one of the things also with sustainability is that it's very unequal. It's not only the global in the south and the north, which is of course we have the benefits in the global south. There are a lot of the costs, but it's also inside our country. Certain jobs, certain consumption, certain choices we make that impact certain groups much more than other groups. And if we want sustainability transformation, everyone needs to be on board. And for that also there needs to be redistribution of cost and benefits. Also think of how we treat waste. Now we produce a lot of waste, and who is paying for collecting and treating that waste? It's the local governments, it's us. And who produced and who got the profit from that waste is a totally different party. And if we can redistribute cost and benefits, overall, the transformation is much more sustainable in a way that it can be. And finally, I think we should also go from business to society. And it also links with what matters. Can we measure it, or can we redistribute cost and benefits? And so we think often, what is the business model? And then I think at a traditional ways, what kind of profits they make? And is it interesting for a company? But if we better understand what matters, and if we better understand the impact not only on the company, but also on society and the environment, we can think of societal models. And we can decide, is this something we want to invest in with public money, for example? Because where are the costs and the benefits? Does it make us overall better, happier, healthier? Then we can invest in that. And so it has to do with the evaluation of labor, of the cost of materials, impact on CO2, and also be open of the value of what can become. And I think this is what I want to end with. It's better understanding the system, rethinking what is our economy, why do we have an economy, what do we need from that economy, and how can we make it work for us instead of overly against us. Thank you very much.
So now it's time for some questions. Are there any questions, comments from the audience? So now it's time for some questions.
So thank you for the presentation. A quick question. When I think about the notion of secularity going around just relative to our economy, I worry a bit about the local, regional, national, and then global perspective. And I guess my question is, how do we approach circularity looking at the idea that there's a global driver that we also have to consider? I would suggest at the outset. How do you think about that?
I think indeed that the multi-level perspective in space is really important for circularity. And I think there are different things that you can do at local level and regional level. And of course, we are all connected. But also we have to realize that the benefits and costs are also multi-level. And so that if we have a regional circular economy, I think the advantage there is that it's not so abstract anymore. If we think about the regional circular economy, we talk about real partners, we talk about real impact and solutions that are related to the challenges of that economy and the characteristics of that economy and the people living there. And of course, they're still tied, they still tied to global and national networks, and they should be. I think we cannot be resilient in a regional economy. There are a lot of benefits from being connected to other parts of the world. But for example, in Amsterdam, another example because I work there, they think about this donut economics. And so they also want to say, we want to be carbon neutral in 2030 actually already. But we should not only look what we emit really in the city boundaries, but also what we through our consumption emit somewhere else. And of course, then it becomes a different goal. And the first thing is know that, have insights in that. And secondly is then the question, yeah, how can you have influence on that? But we should not only look what we emit really is.
Thank you, Evelyn. It was a really fascinating presentation. I think reframing could have a circular society rather than a circular economy could have a strong policy impact. But talking about policy impact, politicians here, maybe in the UK, but also in the Netherlands and in other countries, sometimes telling to us, when we think about a net zero strategy, it has to be a pro-growth strategy, otherwise business leaders and so on are going to move. But talking about policy, not people like me who focus on the growth and that is like very discouraging. So what could you tell to these politicians that the net zero strategy has to be a pro-growth strategy?
Yeah. Well, I think you're right, but I also think that there's a lot of demands from also companies, for example, and regions and cities to have these kind of programs. And so I wouldn't say it should become totally from bottom up, but when we talk also in our ecosystem to big companies, they also see that things are getting worse. They want to contribute, but they also need rules and programs. So I think we really need also some very bold choices perhaps from the national government. And I think also, even though of course there's a heterogeneity of opinions in companies, but there's also a stronger demand for it. And I think also in the meantime, having these experiments, these living labs with what works and what doesn't work in certain contexts. For example, having these areas where you have the legislation can be different, that is kind of sentience. I think it's also from the EU. There's some legislation on that. We were working in the harbor of Amsterdam, so there are different rules. So you can, before there's that kind of program, already experiment with solutions and not wait for the program, but we still have that.
Okay, thank you very much, Evelyn.
Hello everyone, my name is Jo Williams. I'm a professor at University College London, just down the road here. I'm also director of the Circular Cities Research Hub, which is based at UCL. Having said that, I'm not going to be talking about circular cities today, because I'm just talking about transitioning to living systems. So taking a more regenerative approach to that. And I'm going to be talking about it in terms of looking at cities and their regions, and how we might try and attempt to do that. So I'm coming from a spatial planning perspective, if you like. So as Evelyn's already said, really cities are sort of the epicenters, if you like, in terms of potential for innovation and change, but also centres where resources are consumed, waste is produced, and pollution, of course, is produced as well. The ecological implications of the fact that the city metabolizes so many resources and produces so much waste are quite extreme, and our city is already going through a process and have been over sort of the last 100 odd years at sort of going towards ecological decline of the ecosystems within the cities and their regions. And if we think about an urban ecosystem rather than cities and their regions, we can think more clearly, I think, about how we might address this problem. So we need to think about the interrelationship between the city and its hinterland, or the city and all of the places it interacts with in order to sustain itself, essentially. Because cities have degraded, it makes it quite difficult, but the ecosystems have degraded, it makes it difficult from two perspectives. Firstly, if we're going to try and improve the health of the ecosystem and those living in it, but secondly, also, if we're going to move towards cities producing more of their own resources locally. Having said that, if we want to move towards systems which are more sustainable and regenerative, we have to think about how we're going to, firstly, reduce resource consumption. Secondly, look towards localizing some of these urban ecosystems, so reducing the distance over which many of these resources move. And when I talk about resources, I'm talking about energy, materials, water. I'm also thinking about the types of resources within cities we have already, the infrastructure, for example. We want to localize resource flows, and of course we do want to look towards trying to recirculate some of these resources within the urban ecosystem through reuse, recycling, energy recovery, and so on. So it's a sort of a combination of those activities that we need: reduction, localization, and looping, if you like. But in addition to this, we also need to think about how we restore the natural cycles, if you like, within our cities, in order that we can also look at how we enable the cycles of the various resources, because of course, if we don't have healthy soils within our cities, we can't grow food. If we don't have a well-managed system in terms of water systems, we have problems with drought and flooding and so on. So we also need to think about those natural cycles, the technospheric and natural cycles. So I mean, I'm pinching this, okay? So this is moving towards more regenerative systems. So it's beyond sustainability, if you like, and it's thinking about what is the potential for this system, and it's thinking about systems in terms of not human and natural systems, but us as part of that system. So we are integral to that. There's no dualism between the two. Also, we need to recognise the importance of context. I don't need to tell you that, bearing in mind your backgrounds, but we need to think about the full potential of our urban ecosystems, our regions, if you like, in terms of the type of local resources that are available, the ecological assets, and all the other assets, the social assets, the economic and cultural assets, and so on. We need to recognise the importance of the city and its hinterland relationship. So we need to think more in terms of becoming more symbiotic and cities being less parasitic, essentially. So more needs to happen in cities than does currently in terms of producing their own resources, recirculating resources, and also providing some of their own ecosystem services, so that not all the pressure is being put on the hinterlands. So more needs to happen. Also, if you have a regenerative approach to development, you need to engage lots of people in that process. So it's about people becoming the co-producers, co-provisioners in this process. And they have a responsibility within that to not only think about design solutions and planning solutions, but also to be part of that change. So they need to be responsible for the regeneration of that system. Co-producers, co-provisioners. So what's this going to look like? Well, okay, so this is stargazing time, but essentially it has been done to a sort of a lesser extent, or it's being attempted in sort of cities, certainly within Europe. Firstly, we would be having cities and regions that adopt these sort of looping actions. So reuse, recycling, and recovery, which would operate across a range of scales. You need circular infrastructural systems. So you need things like grey-water recycling, you need things like waste-to-energy systems. You need flexible, adaptable infrastructure. You also need activities that support this, so things to do with the bioeconomy, for example, construction loops, food loops, nutrient loops, industrial symbiosis within these areas, and that's going to impact on the way that we plan our regions. We also need to think about integrating more blue and green infrastructure throughout that fabric, throughout that system. So within cities, yes, in corridors, linking into our regions, surrounding cities, into the peripheries, in order that we get the benefits of that blue and green infrastructure. But we also need to think about, again, the activities. So the activities that we need to manage water systems, to conserve biodiversity, and so on, urban farming, urban forestry, orchards, this kind of thing. We also need to think about providing space within this system to enable transformation to actually take place, which will also help us to reduce resource consumption overall in the long term. Particularly if we can provide infrastructure which is more scalable, flexible, within those spaces, which can actually change with those sort of evolving needs. And alongside this, we also need to build the ability of communities to engage in that process, which will probably require funding, and will certainly also require land in order for them to do so. So this enables them to be part of that process and self-organise in order to do this. And this links back to some of what Lars was talking about earlier with the experimentation and so on, and the need to scale up on the things people need in order for that to happen. This is likely to impact on urban morphology, so it's likely to impact on densities, land use activities in cities and infrastructure. Equally, it's going to impact on the way we strategically plan, I guess. So you can look at things like, for example, creation of waste nodes for reuse and recycling. We can look at symbiotic industrial clusterings. We can look at blue and green corridors. Perhaps we can use that old polynucleate idea again and think about how different nodes can act in different ways in order to deliver this across the region. So overall, we need to think about how we can, the idea is to try and localise the provision of resources and ecosystem services. And I'm being very careful here not to say exactly what local means, but it's certainly bigger than a city. And it certainly could include many or several cities across the region. It could be that we're looking at sort of a network hubs within this, for example. This would mean, if we were looking at it, this would mean closing low-value resource loops and regenerating ecosystem services locally. But currently, resource flows are largely governed by markets. So, for example, looping of low-value organic and construction waste would be viable at a local scale. And higher value material loops are generally sort of conducted at a more national, international level. Equally, the regeneration of the ecosystem is affected by existing institutional and financial infrastructure. So although often it works better at a very local level, that then relies on sort of volunteers and sort of local experiments, community type experiments to make this happen. So again, this creates a problem if we haven't got the financial and political prioritisation of these types of activities, which means it's then difficult for that to work. So again, in some ways, that's governed, if you like, by the financial sort of criteria. In a regenerative paradigm, I suppose, and this also talks to Evelyn's piece, we really need to move away from what is market logic towards eco logic if we're going to have any chance of improving on this. Regenerative. So this is from a bit of research I did a while ago, which basically looks at the synergies you get if you bring together various strategies within cities, and it's looking across a lot of different European cities where they try to bring these strategies together. And we certainly see that there are synergistic benefits from the idea of ecological regeneration coupled with looping actions, coupled with adaptive actions, and then if you bring localization into that mix, you can also accelerate the benefits that you actually get from adopting these different strategies. So there's evidence, for example, localized resource looping can increase the economic viability of activities. It can also create activities which boost the local economy, so you can start to see relationships here. Localized resources, production also obviously reduces transportation and therefore emissions. And high levels of community engagement in local regeneration helps to build local social capital and human capital, which increases the community resilience and adaptability. However, there should be a health warning on this, because there are also problems with localization in terms of delivering this agenda. For example, we found that opportunities for resource looping can be limited by the number of producers and consumers using those recyclates, for example, within a region. If you don't have enough producers or consumers, there can be an issue with that. For example, localization of systems also might reduce the carrying capacity in which you're operating in, because essentially you have a smaller space, therefore you have less resources and less potential for assimilation of waste locally. So it does need to be taken at a sort of multi-level perspective. Also might reduce the examples of where this is happening or starting to happen, or at least the agenda to happen. So we have here two cities taking a more city regional approach to this sort of a regenerative approach. Amsterdam is looking to close resource loops where possible for both organic and construction waste. Top right here. So for example, wastewater is used to produce compost, feedstock, pharmaceuticals, construction materials and energy, and this helps to increase both local food security and energy security. It also diversifies the local economy and expands industrial sectors, some of which they already exist in the sort of biochemicals area, and helps it to take more sustainable pathways. But it's using the potentials that are there. So it's basically drawing on local agriculture, biochem industries, the international transport connections and so on, to build this strategy. Paris, on the bottom here, Paris is adopting a similar approach because it too is looking at regional food production and closing food loops regionally, and that's partly by growing food within the city, but also using land directly outside the city to produce food. Also, they've got a food reuse strategy which helps to also underpin this, which is of course made more substantial as a result of having legislation which supports it at a national level. In addition to this, it's looking at construction waste, and it's also looping construction waste, and it's also creating clusters, industrial clusters, to encourage symbiosis within Paris. Of course, for a very long time, Paris has had a grey water recycling system. It also uses its organic waste, its food waste, for compost and to create biogas for the city. These are great examples, but so much more work needs to be done to look at how these same solutions might play out across a less urban region, for example. How could more polynucleate clustered approach to regenerative development close resource loops? And through linking activities and to enable ecological regeneration to happen. And also, how can this actually work with very large cities? So how on the one hand can it work with sort of smaller populations, more sort of dispersed, but also how can this work with very large cities, given essentially the number of people that will be requiring those resources. Also, how can it work with very large cities? So how on one hand, in terms of looking at regenerative regions, there are going to be a lot of challenges, essentially. One of the biggest challenges is the low political priority of environmental goals, ecological goals, unless they're linked, of course, to jobs, health, and possibly resource security. There's also going to be issues around scale and cross-boundary coordination. We need to manage resources and ecosystem services at appropriate scale, but this often requires cooperation across those boundaries, those administrative boundaries. This creates issues around who benefits and who pays, essentially, for that, for these activities. The scale and the locality at which benefits and disbenefits emerge will affect whether these are politically and socially acceptable. So if essentially you're going to put all your biogas digesters in the periphery directly outside urban areas, then you're going to have to explain to those people why they need to go there in order to service the cities. Alternatively, you can think about the benefits that might accrue as a result of doing this, or you might need to think more about how to mix these projects more effectively to encourage that social and political acceptance. So negotiating cross-border collaboration is difficult, I think. The competencies and resources of regional authorities as well, of course, create problems. Many regional authorities have neither competencies nor resources in order to make this sort of thing happen. So the question is, what levers then can be used to sort of see this into fruition? There's a lack of data, it's often aggregated, but without the data, without being able to make a case essentially for this kind of transformation, how do you get the political buy-in, the interest from the political elite, but also how do you get interest from investors? So if you want people to invest in these systems, again, you need to demonstrate the benefit of that, and monitoring would help to do this. Of course, it could also be used to help engage wider society. I think the other problem is that there's a very long time frame here, and essentially, it takes a while for ecosystems to regenerate, if you like, but we're dealing with short political and investment time frames. And finally, I suppose at a regional level, one of the difficulties is how do we engage communities? It's easier to engage community in streets, in neighbourhoods and so on, but how do we get this cross-community coordination and engagement? And maybe we need to do this in a sort of a large number of different ways. And we can draw from Paris as one of the places that managed to do this, at least the strategy, and then engage with co-provision. But how do we get this cross-community? In terms of sort of further research, I think there's been a lot of work in looking at things like eco-localism. It's sort of more from an economy perspective, bioregionalism, more from a planning perspective, but it's always talked about in very conceptual terms. There's very little that's being done to look at how we might implement this, and I suggest it's time we looked at how we might implement this. I think there's sort of three areas we might want to focus in: spatial planning. At what scale should we try to achieve this, or what different scales in actual fact? What types of activities should we be trying to encourage, and how can we create clusters and links that will support this in the real world? I think in terms of governance, how do we coordinate across these boundaries? How do we increase the competencies and resources available to the urban ecosystem governance structure, if you like, in order to make that happen? And how do we then engage communities at that level? And then finally, when we're thinking about data, we don't just want to be thinking about monitoring, we also want to be thinking about things like engaging people in funding these situations, things like through crowdsourcing, for example, so providing platforms for that, but equally providing platforms for wider engagement with society, because if we really want to understand the potentials for these regions, we need to talk to the people that live and work and organise and manage and are engaged within those regions. Crowdsourcing, for example, so providing platforms for that, equally providing platforms. So I believe there's if we really want to understand we need to talk to people and manage and engage within So I think the first question was, are you currently, is anyone working in this sort of area or in related fields? I think probably most of you would possibly say no. How to think of yes, no questions, it's tricky. So I think the first question was, are you currently, is anyone working in this
Not that, it's the Wi-Fi. It's
Yeah, answer.
Yeah, would you mind doing the old fashioned way? And in actual fact, the resource efficient way. If you are engaged in activities which relate to this, and could you possibly raise your hand?
Yeah, answer.
That's probably about a third of the audience, okay. Okay, thank you. We'll talk to you afterwards. The second question was, how can the difficulties of cross-boundary coordination be addressed within regions? Oh, it's up. Probably about. Well, no, have you, oh, okay, I've got different questions here, so what's that? The second question was, how can difficulties of cross-boundary coordination be addressed within regions? Have you observed similar difficulties in cross-boundary coordination? Yes, most people have. So, I mean, I'm thinking here in terms of this particular perspective, so it's looking at ecosystems sort of and ecosystem services and resource flows, but obviously, you know, we've explored these sort of issues in sort of previous history around commuting patterns, for example, lots of other kind of regional implementation problems.
Right, maybe we can open the floor for a few questions to Joanna. So if you have some comments or questions, please. Open the floor for a few questions to Joanna. So
I saw Andy White from Kurds, Newcastle University. This is fascinating stuff. I was going to ask you about the evaluation of these interdependencies, these synergies, because it seems when we've done previous work on infrastructure with civil engineers, for example, they're always crying about how on earth you value these interdependencies between infrastructure systems, and that seems quite a fundamental question in terms of how you sort of move the frames of reference for valuing things that these synergies and interdependencies can bring in terms of this broader project of moving wise about regenerative sort of model of city regions. So I wanted to see any comments on that, please.